their servant. So we know that Nebuchadnezzar did not travel to every inch of the globe. But here's what we just learned. Had he done so, he would have conquered every living thing on earth because God had prepared it for him. God has decreed that it would be so. Isn't that interesting? You don't have to exercise the authority God gives you to have it. And in this case, he had the authority, though he couldn't exercise it to the extent that would have proven it, but it was there. So he is assigned this immense amount of power, one-man government, one-man rule of the whole planet for a period of time. But at the same time, we also heard through Jeremiah, for example, that this rule was not going to last forever. That is to say that God was going to take Nebuchadnezzar's place away at some point, and others were going to make him their servant. And as a result, we come to understand that in this statue, though it starts with a representation of Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon, certainly, and Babylon was a very powerful world leader or a very powerful empire in its day. It stretched virtually from Europe, present-day Greece, all the way into India, northern Africa. It's quite an expanse to cover in that day, and it ruled to that extent. But in biblical terms, he had rule of the whole planet. But then it was going to come to an end. And so we see from Jeremiah that it wasn't a permanent position of authority, and we see from Daniel, coming back now to the text of Daniel, that he wasn't the last empire of the earth either, because there's still a lot of statue left. Daniel says in chapter 2, verse 39, after you, I'm sure Nebuchadnezzar was loving the prophecy until we got to that verse. After you, there will arise another kingdom inferior to you, and then another third kingdom of bronze, which will rule over all the earth. So Daniel tells Nebuchadnezzar, you're the beginning, but you're not the end. There will be another kingdom, and it will replace you, and then a third kingdom will come along and replace the second one. We're in a series or a sequence of ruling here. So before we look at who the second and third are, you need to understand what you just learned about the statue in and of itself. You just learned that the head of gold stood for one kingdom, and now as we move to a new material, we move to a new kingdom. So each material means a new kingdom. And as such, when you move down from top to bottom on this statue, what you're realizing is this is a timeline. The statue itself represents the passage of time. From a certain moment when Nebuchadnezzar became king to some future moment that we haven't defined yet. So it's a creative way of representing the passage of time. And that passage of time is called the age of the Gentiles. You're looking at the start of the age of the Gentiles. How do we know that this is the beginning of the age of the Gentiles? Well, remember what the definition of the age of the Gentiles is. The people of Israel scattered outside their land, persecuted, enslaved, killed, and the nation of Israel's capital city trampled by Gentiles. The very first time those two things were true in history was when Nebuchadnezzar conquered Jerusalem. Before that, never had happened. Since that has happened, it's never not been this way. It's never been the case that Israel has fully regained a completely peaceful and exclusive control of their capital city. Never has it been the case that Israel has ceased to be persecuted, enslaved, killed, and so on. There have been certainly good periods of history relative to others. There have been bad periods of history relative, but the pattern has not fundamentally changed. So before that moment, when Solomon was king, Israel was the world superpower. They were the most powerful nation in their area of the world. No one challenged Solomon. And in a period of time from then until 605 BC, we move from that state of affairs to Israel entering in the age of the Gentiles. So now we're here to understand how this age proceeds. Knowing now that it has started and how it started, now we're going to look at more of how it proceeds through time. Daniel says the second kingdom will defeat Babylon and yet be inferior to Babylon. The inferiority of the second kingdom is represented by the fact that silver is of lesser value than gold. And we understand why silver is considered less valuable. It's the way we assign value to precious metal. But what does it say about the second kingdom that it's representing? How is the kingdom less valuable than Babylon, so to speak, and yet still able to conquer Babylon. Well, to understand that question, you have to understand what kingdom replaced Babylon in history. Daniel doesn't give us that. At the time that Daniel wrote this, it was still future, even for Daniel. And as we look at possibilities, like what nations might we suggest as options for the next in line? Well, it's not hard to find them, but even if we were to stop before we look, there is a set of rules we can follow that ensure we don't pick the wrong ones. And the rules come out of the age of the Gentiles definition. What are the rules? Well, here are the criteria for whether or not you can be one of the precious metals in the statute. First of all, you got to be a Gentile kingdom. So it's never going to be Israel. Israel's never one of the pieces of the statute for obvious reasons. They're not going to persecute themselves. It's a Gentile persecution period, okay? Secondly, they have to be the dominant power in their day. If you can name a power and I can name a more dominant one, you haven't got the right one. So they've got to be the most dominant power of their day. Thirdly, they have to defeat their predecessor. That's a pretty clear sign. They have to be the one that replaces the one before. And if you're going to fulfill the purpose of the age of the Gentiles, you have to trample Jerusalem, which in my way of saying it is you have to control Jerusalem. You have to invade Jerusalem. And here's a bit of a corollary. If you're going to defeat the predecessor, and the predecessor in this case is Babylon, what land must you also have in order to complete this four-part requirement? If you're going to have to defeat Babylon, what must you have control of? Babylon. So, in other words, you not only have occupation of Jerusalem, you have to occupy Babylon. Because if you want to conquer the United States, you got to take Washington, D.C., right? That's the idea. So, we look for a nation that was able to take, a Gentile nation that was able to take Jerusalem and Babylon in displacing the nation of Babylon, and there's only one, of course, that meets that definition, and that's the Medo-Persian Empire. So the Medo-Persian Empire came along in 550 BC, and that kingdom was formed out of an alliance of the Medes and the Persians, which is why they call it the Medo-Persian Empire, and that's why in the statue, their part of the statue is represented by the two arms. Now, most people who draw the statue have drawn it with arms crossed, but it's interesting, that's not actually in the text. And the arms could be like this, I guess, but I don't mind that they're crossed. I think that's probably appropriate, but the point is just that it's not in the dream. Nonetheless, those two arms represent the Medes and the Persians working together in one kingdom. All right? This kingdom had the power to challenge Babylon in sheer numbers. They were known for overwhelming armies. They would mass millions of men. And even if Babylon had better armament or was more sophisticated in the way that they conducted battle, there's a certain point at which numbers just win. And that was the way that the Medo-Persians did their work. So they were less majestic in that respect, and yet still able to conquer. And to understand how they were less majestic beyond simply that, you have to also understand how they governed. In the case of the Babylonians, Nebuchadnezzar, we've already been told, had complete control over the whole planet, even though he didn't exercise it. But that was never given to Cyrus or Darius or any of the other leaders of the Medo-Persian Empire. So there's no indication that that level of authority was passing down. God started the first with it, but he never gave it to anyone after that. And yet those other nations did conquer. So they conquered, but they did it less majestically. They had less authority. And even in the way they ruled their own people, they had less dominance. Nebuchadnezzar was an absolute despot. He could do whatever he wanted. There were no rules. But in the Medo-Persian way of ruling, kings had power, yes, but they were required to obey or to keep prior precedent, to not change prior kings' rulings, kind of like the way courts work today. That was a kind of a check on their power. So that diminished them to some extent. All right? So we find them to be a lesser kingdom, and yet they managed to conquer. So we now have the Medo-Persians. Third, verse 39, Daniel goes on to say a third kingdom will assume power